Welcome to the AI Standards Stack with me, Michael Mainelli, Director at Zien Group.
And me, Adam Smith, Chair of the AIQI Consortium.
Each episode on AI Standards Stack, we discuss developments in AI assurance with guests from around the world that are leading the charge on the standards, ethics, and regulation of AI. This episode of the AI Standards Stack is supported by the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, UKAS, the UK's national accreditation body. UKAS ensures organizations that test, inspect, and certify AI systems are technically competent, impartial, and robust, building confidence in safe, reliable, and trustworthy AI.
On the show today, we're joined by Patrick Sullivan, Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at A-Line, an internationally recognized provider of cybersecurity audit, certification, and compliance services. With over 25 years' experience in IT security and compliance, Patrick specializes in AI governance, cybersecurity, and regulatory frameworks. As an ISO committee member, he collaborates with global leaders and experts to shape the future of AI regulation and standardization.
Well, welcome to the show, Patrick. The whole idea of the AI Standards Stack podcast is really to try and unpick the full stack of standards, ethics, and regulation. And it's a pleasure to have you on. But before we dive in, would you like to just say a few words, particularly about your background and history before A-Line?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, Michael. First of all, thank you for the opportunity. As I mentioned in the lead up to this, when I saw that Adam was a participant in the series, there was no way I was going to say no. So very, very honored and grateful to be here. So my background is varied, quite frankly. Joseph Campbell has a quote that one should follow their bliss. If you follow your bliss, doors will open where before there were only walls. And so I set out 30 years ago at this point down the path of studying electronics. I was absolutely certain that I wanted to understand everything I could about electronic components and how to build communication systems from the ground up. What I discovered through that process is that there are, in fact, other tangential areas of interest that we find as we push ourselves to grow. So over the course of my career, I've been really blessed to serve in a number of different roles in a number of different capacities, from network engineering, administration, healthcare, IT. At one point in my career, close to 20 years ago now, I was fortunate to be able to help start a medical school. So lots of really interesting things have been part of my journey, and the decision to continue to follow my bliss in those areas where I find myself of most use in serving the community have led me where we are today.
Well, it's an interesting area you work in, and we're not going to be covering it today, but you were the working group lead for the International Association of Algorithmic Auditors, and a lot of this might strike a few people as quite mysterious. And your firm, A-Line, is well known as an auditor and certification body for technical standards. What does that mean? What do you actually do? You walk onto a site and you do what?
We do X. We make people very uncomfortable. No, all joking aside, we recognize from a standards perspective that organizations largely have an opportunity to consume standards, interpret them, and then implement those standards based on their own interpretations. So there's an entire community that exists to provide objectivity, review, and evaluation of how those standards have been implemented. And that really is where organizations like A-Line sit. We're a third-party cybersecurity assessment firm, but we assess against most of the common third-party standards, SOC 2, HIPAA, ISO. We are an ISO certification body, conformity assessment body, and some vernacular. Ultimately, we exist to ensure we ensure that organizations have the objective feedback they need to ensure that the systems that they've implemented to maintain control of security, privacy, their AI lifecycle have actually been implemented in such a way that we can offer assurance that those organizations are doing the right thing as it relates to the systems themselves. So to say it in fewer words, I have a standard, I've implemented it, now I need an objective third party to check that I've implemented it correctly and offer assurance to my community that I'm doing the right things. That's exactly where A-Line sits in our ecosystem.
And in the jargon, you're not an accreditor, you're a certifier?
That's correct. That's correct.
And who is accrediting you?
So right now we carry 2 accreditations, one through ANAB and one through UCAS.
Very good. And declaration to listeners, I'm the senior non-executive director of UCAS, but I think it's important to be clear about that sort of transparency there. Now, that's fascinating. Now, you do handle a range of standards, SOC 1 and 2, as you mentioned, PCI DSS, and of course, we're particularly interested, or I am anyway. Ada's probably bored now, but in your thoughts on ISO 42001, and I'd be curious if you could just share with the audience what the evolution of 42001 looked like from the role of a certifier. So it started obviously a number of years ago. It's only relatively recently released. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, and so really from the eyes of a certifier, I think we can better represent the eyes of the community. So to your point, 42001 as a standard was released in December of 2023. And a lot of the early misunderstandings we saw around 42001's utility rested on people thinking that it was an AI security standard. Most organizations are familiar with 27001 and the concept of really managing information security from an organization's perspective. As 42001 hit, there was a natural confusion, which became, in effect, an understanding, a pervasive misunderstanding in the community that 42001 was about AI security. If we're doing 27001 real already, what real value will we find in implementing this new framework? And so we've worked very hard over the past few years. Adam, thank you for everything that you're doing to be part of the re-education. To now we're facing different confusions. As you've likely seen, Michael, one of the big points of pushback against implementation of 42001 today is the confusion that many organizations believe that 42001 is intended to satisfy requirements and obligations associated with the EU AI Act. And because we recognize that it does not, suddenly the credibility of 42001 as a tool for organizations to improve their AI lifecycle has been put in question. Again, fundamental misunderstanding, fundamental misrepresentation, but really where the hard work today rests in continuing to re-educate so that organizations, first of all, understand what 42001 as a framework is, secondly, what it isn't, and where it should really rest inside your organization is you're building not only your regulatory defense posture, but also your traditional compliance strategy posture.
I don't know why you think I'm bored of 42001, Michael. I've just sat my lead auditor exam and become qualified so I can spend more time with the standard. The more organizations I talk to, the more I realize that almost every organization needs to start with working out who they're going to be regulated by, who else might have opinions about how they manage AI, what their AI systems are, and what they do, and what their role is in respect of the AI system before they can do anything else. And that is clause 4 of ISO IEC 42001. So even if an organization isn't going to go and get certified, it's the right place for everybody to start. And one of the things I noticed very recently is the amount of accredited certifications increasing. And incredible statistic, it's gone up year on year to March 2026, 1,800%. Which is a huge increase. It's not entirely surprising because there weren't that many organizations able to certify in an accredited way, the year before. But that data is really starting to show really strong uptake of ISO IEC 42001, which is great.
Totally agree, Adam. And not only do we see it in the certification data from IAF, but we see it in market. We see organizations like Microsoft, Oracle recently, Anthropic. Down the line, we see more and more enterprises recognizing the value and utility of 42001 certification, earning their certifications with full expectation that they'll push those expectations down their supply chain. And so the reality is, even if regulation isn't a concern for the enterprises, for our listeners, even if regulation isn't your number one concern today, market pressure absolutely should be.
Were you involved at all, Patrick, in the development of the standard prior to December 23?
I got involved in ISO Special Committee 42 after December of 23. So I became part of the process well after 42001 was finalized.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it is impressive results in the last 2.5 years. In fact, I personally found the Oracle announcement of all of them, and there are quite a few really impressive. It's a large organization working on it for quite some period of time. And I was, funnily enough, on the phone this morning with a financial services regulator talking about yet another um, charter that people might sign. And I said, well, what about Oracle? And they're like, well, they just signed up to 42,000. I said, no, they did not sign up to it. This is a huge commitment, and it's vastly better than the chief executive plunking a signature of his or hers on a piece of paper they haven't read. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Now you sell this to people, right? That's your business. What's the sales pitch?
Yeah, and so to be clear, we sell certification services. ISO as an architecture exists in and of itself. Yeah, but as a certification body, this has been an evolution as well. Quite frankly, Adam, you know this. I tend to be overly optimistic. I tend to see the best in everything, and so initially, my market approach to organizations was we now have an internationally recognized consensus-based framework that shows us how to responsibly develop and use AI. Why wouldn't we want to do this? And what I found is that by and large, businesses don't care. And that sounds harsh. I don't mean for it to sound critical in any way. But the reality is, businesses are always looking for ways to ensure that they can keep their lights on. And so additional extraneous costs are just that, unless there's a significant business justification. And Michael, what we've seen is that by and large, the significant business justification of late is risk management. We know ISO management systems are there to allow us to take a risk-based view into certain processes in our organization, whether it's security management, AI lifecycle, privacy management, whatever the case. But in managing risk, particularly around third-party vendors, we found a hook to really hang conversations around that help organizations understand there is utility in this framework. There is something here for me. I need to start building. In addition to that, we see, though, and again, I know 42001 is not a sufficient stand-in for high-risk AI system QMS requirements as they relate to the AI Act. We do see an incredible proxy, an incredible foundation to begin building as we do wait on more information about the finalized standards, those harmonized standards to be written into the journal, and for organizations to have an effective line in the sand beyond which we know they will be required to have a high-risk QMS in place. A lot of words to say, 42001 is an incredible tool to lay a foundation that we then extend to meet the real obligations that are coming.
The flip side of that is that harmonized standards for high-risk AI are not very much use if your goal is to meet customer requirements, to align with business objectives, or continual improvement. So there is no, they don't exactly overlap entirely.
And the beauty here is to build a foundation on 42001 that we then extend to 18286 allows us to undergo independent third-party certification, to have assurance documents for the business community, and have real processes and practices in place to build the technical documentation we need to withstand an audit from a notified body.
I'm going to get into the international area in a minute, but just before I do so, have you got any kind of good war stories of where 42,001 has done something material, not kind of management abstract jargon, but where it's really, you went in, did your certification thing, and went, do you realize this? And it needed to be changed.
Yeah, and so maybe less a war story about corrective action, more a war story about value.
Okay.
So we partnered with an organization that creates synthetic media. It's probably been a year and a half, 2 years ago now. They wanted to be the first organization in their vertical that actually had the ability to offer a 42001 certified product to the market. We evaluated them. They had built things appropriately. We audited them, issued their certification. And that certification became one of the assurance pieces needed to ensure that they were able to take in additional investment. And so we saw this organization over the course of the 2 years after certification And Michael, I may be misstating, but they took in rounds B and C and are now evaluated at well over $1 billion. Not saying that 42001 was directly responsible for all of that, but 42001 absolutely played a role in ensuring the continued investment that they did receive.
Yeah, well, we've had a couple of people on the program, particularly with relations with the International Corporate Governance Network, where they've drafted this coffee house consensus saying that countries where they invest and companies in which they invest really ought to have 42001. So it's nice to hear this from the ground as well, as opposed to the abstract from the level that they have. But they claim some $33 trillion of their 77 trillion have signed up to this. But moving along, now you touched a few minutes ago on something I'd like to explore, which had to do with the EU's AI Act and its relationship with 42001. Now, you were clear, and I'll be absolutely clear, that there's technically no relationship whatsoever. The two things are effectively completely separate elements. And yet, there's certainly been a lot of talk from Europe that for the non-high risk, for the bulk, if you can demonstrate 42001, we can deem you to be probably quite compliant with the EU's AI Act. How would you react to that?
I would think that's a dangerous assumption to make, quite frankly, Michael. And so, first of all, I do want to step back and not to argue with you, but to express a
Oh,
different opinion. I do think there is direct connection between 42001 and 18286, which is the standard intended to give organizations the tools they need to be successful in meeting
mhm.
their requirements to the AI Act. In fact, as we look in the annexes of 18286, we see the direct mappings wherein 42001 and 9001 were used as takeoff points. We'll see in 18286 the same high level structure. Adam, I think it's Annex SL, used to create the format for 18286. So to characterize them as completely disconnected and not technically related, for me, is not an appropriate characterization. What I would say is that they're intended to create two very different sets of outcomes. 42001 is meant to solve a particular problem, to create a solution for organizations to meet the needs of, and ISO doesn't use stakeholders, Adam, it's interested parties. We're looking to meet the
Yeah,
needs
that's
of
right.
interested parties through the build and deployment, the operationalization of 42001. With 18286, we're looking to meet the needs of the regulatory regime, specifically around product safety in the EU. Two different things entirely. It turns out the mechanisms, the muscles that will move to create those outcomes, in many ways have similarity.
I think just to follow up on that, I think the utility of 42001 is sometimes talked about in the context of the quality management system in the AI Act. But in reality, the quality management system in the AI Act is largely about things like serious incident reporting, post-market monitoring, which are concepts that don't exist in 42001. It's also the framework that you use to choose all the other standards and the state-of-the-art techniques that you're going to use to ensure compliance with the rest of the AI Act. So you will, if you try and use 42001 for that, you may get halfway, but you're not going to get anywhere near compliance with that article.
Adam, Article 15, or cybersecurity and trustworthiness, none of that is addressed through 42001. So to
Yeah.
your point, we get ourselves down the road and we produce a system that can be reused and repurposed to meet two fundamentally different sets of stakeholders, sets of interested parties.
Now, picking up on this, that's kind of the European view. What's it like on the other side of the pond, NIST, and that? What are your thoughts there?
My thoughts probably shouldn't be shared necessarily on a podcast. No, what I would say is in the U.S., the U.S. approach appears to be one of removing obstacles to innovation without much better clarity. So what we do know at this point is that many states have gone online with their own, in effect, mini AI acts to be implemented at a state level. We also know, based on some recent decrees, that from a federal perspective, no state will be able to enforce regulations that become prohibitive or restrictive on innovation. So largely in the U.S., we're left in a lurch, for lack of better words, Michael. We're in organizations understand that we need to be doing things. We need to be doing things to ensure that the systems we're deploying are not causing harms. But we don't necessarily have solid guidance outside of the international standard in 42001, and to some extent, some of our NIST frameworks to follow. And so in the US, well, let me rephrase this. In Europe, we're very much regulation driven as it relates to building good practice. In the US, we're very much market driven. We mentioned before some of the significant enterprises that have undergone 42001 certification with an expectation that their suppliers will do the same. In the US, we're really leaving the implementation of solid, responsible AI development and use practices to the market. The market will demand what the market needs from organizations so that we can have those interconnections of trust. From a federal perspective, we know that things are coming. We don't know necessarily what those things are or when they'll be coming, unfortunately.
One thing I find really interesting is in the EU, we have this presumption of conformity with harmonized standards. And I understand in some states, I think Texas and Washington, there is similar legal concepts emerging where you get an affirmative defense if you're complying with either the NIST risk management framework or ISO IEC 42001. And I think in California, there's an approach where you disclose your approach to standards as part of your transparency mechanisms. So I think this is really interesting that I'm not going to say the Brussels effect, but this idea of linking regulation to standards is taking effect in the US as well as Europe, which I personally think is great.
There's no question. And Adam, I think the second regulation that you were talking about was Colorado and Colorado SB 205. But in both Texas's TRIGA, the Texas Responsible AI Governance Act, and then Colorado SB 205, we have direct references to ISO 42001 and or the NIST AI risk management framework as being safe harbors. So yes, absolutely.
From an organizational point of view, so I mean, a New Bradford, in the Brussels effect is always been an interesting. In fact, we had her in one of our programs once, and she was superb. But I'm CEO of an organization, and I've decided to go for ISO 42001 because the market demands it, or I've decided to go for it because it looks like my regulators are going to require it. Does that really make a difference to you, the certifier on the ground? Does that result in a different kind of implementation, or is once I've made the jump, it's pretty similar?
Once you've made the jump, it can be fairly similar. Michael, with 42001 or any ISO management system, from an audit perspective, really we are tied to the scoping of the management system itself. And so Adam talked about clause 4 earlier, wherein those decisions are made, wherein we really clarify that the scoping of that which this management system is intended to govern and manage. And so through that scoping, organizations will determine not just external regulation, but also customer contractual agreements. Again, all those things that are needed for interested parties to be served well in instances where we recognize that we do have external obligation related to regulation. Those things should be documented as part of the statement of applicability for that particular management system and evaluated accordingly. So by and large, we should not see a difference in evaluation from a certification body perspective of that management system for whoever it's intended to serve. We're there to evaluate that the organization has thought cleanly about who they are, what their role in the ecosystem is, and they thought holistically and systemically about the interested parties that are served by the services that they're putting on the market.
Well, we talk a lot about the States because probably the number one AI power around.
Yes.
And we would argue it's a bit of an incoherent mess at the moment, and you can have views, but that's okay. It's market-led, I get that. We got number 3, which is Europe, which is trying to be much more regimented and regulated and disciplined about it. What about number 2, China? What indications are you seeing there?
Well, we're actually seeing China do some interesting things, and I know that won't be a popular opinion, but with the hard focus on robotics, I think it really is interesting to see where the Chinese initiatives are driving, not just with the development and the innovation coming, but also in their views on regulation of AI itself. Though I wouldn't necessarily tie their views on privacy to those that we see anywhere else in the world. At least from the outside looking in, it does appear that the Chinese are taking a very proactive approach to ensuring privacy and to some degree product safety.
Well, that leads me on to a very interesting question. And again, you touched briefly on, well, Adam did, I believe, on the kind of the difference between a product safety regime, which has got certain types of approaches, and a management system standards approach, like 9,000, 14,000, and some of the others there. So, um, how do you feel that affects one's views on AI governance? Is it kind of, I'll be very different as a robotics firm where I'm kind of got an embedded product I'm shipping versus, say, a financial services firm that's pretty much shipping out kind of thoughts based on AI or analyses based on AI?
Well, and I think the recognition, the goal, the why absolutely sets a different tone. And I will say just openly, the concept of a product safety regime applying to AI is something that's very foreign to most American businesses. But because AI, for all intents and purposes, is intangible, it can be really hard to make the connection that this intangible thing that we would have traditionally thought of as software is in fact a product being placed on the market and requires a similar approach to control and evaluation. So it's been a bit of a stretch for U.S. businesses to accept what the AI Act is actually trying to do and to build systems accordingly. From a management system perspective, however, Michael, and you were going to say something.
No, I was just sort of kind of curious that the minute I take, say, a medical device or a robot or a physical object, I mean, that we have been subject to product safety there in
No
terms of the
question.
control systems for it, and the AI in those products is largely a control system. So, is that foreign, or is it that people are trying to apply it to the intangible, purely data-driven AI, and that doesn't make sense?
The latter, the latter. You know, I do think when we have a tangible, concrete product to touch, I think suddenly the concept of product safety and a product safety initiative become a different thing. It's in those areas that we don't necessarily have that discrete, tangible product when we are leaning on purely intangible code, if you will, that it becomes difficult. But when we step back and think about the definitions vary wildly about what AI is. Largely, there are a few common components. We'll see a component of automated decision making, but then we'll also see a component of the ability to trigger change in an environment, either virtual or physical. And with those things sandwiched together, it's really hard to argue that AI is not a product that we are in fact placing on the market and should be treated accordingly. You know, it's probably a poor analogy, but I've used the analogy of a toaster. If our toaster shot out nails instead of toasted breads, we would all have a very serious problem with that. The reality is that we do have decision engines that are making decisions that, though they are not causing similar harms, are causing harms just the same.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of product safety being applied to AI is not just something that US businesses struggle with. People struggle with it in Europe as well and the UK, particularly those sectors like HR, employment, training, that are used to having a relatively unregulated market to play in.
Yeah.
And if something is going to affect people's health, safety, or human rights, we should check it works properly before we put it on the market, in my view. And some of the pushback I hear on this just, it doesn't stack up for me. So I hear pushback, oh, AI systems change all the time. Well, do they really? Most of the AI systems used in these high-risk environments do not. Even things like Claude and ChatGPT, when they change their system and have a new version, it's in the news. So we do know when these systems are changing. I admit, they drift. There are other ways that they can change in smaller ways. And what the product safety regime says is you need to monitor these things. And if that change can affect compliance with the law, you need to go back through the conformity assessment process. So the
Yes.
product safety regime already handles the fact that things change. So some of the pushback I hear on applying product safety to high risk use cases, I think, is a real stretch.
Well, and Adam, what I think it is an inability to articulate the real problem. So with a toaster, again, it shoots out nails. It's really easy to say, this is a problem. We need to pull this model off the market. With AI, The first question becomes, how do I even monitor the system that I've deployed to the market? What does this even look like? And so what we see is organizations really freezing and trying to make a determination about how to even do the thing that fundamentally they should be able to do. And I don't blame them. It's incredibly difficult to tie the pieces together to show real conformity to obligation. But just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it.
Which leads me on to kind of hard, right? You're out there doing these audits, and as somebody who oversees a lot of these audits, they're not easy to begin with.
No.
Now, an analogy I frequently draw is, I have fire extinguishers, and we've got people out there who certify fire extinguishers. And a fire extinguisher in a bank is no different than one in a retail shop, at a golf course. They're all kind of the same thing. However, the fire management system can be wildly different. Fire management system for a data room, for a bank. These are all quite vastly different things. Now you come in and you say, well, I'm going to do 42001. What sort of skills are required? Because if it's just fire extinguishers, hey, buddy, I know about metal, I know about pressure, give you a tick, I'm done here, and fillings, versus, wow, how do you actually handle a fire in a very sensitive chemical plant? And you're kind of in the middle of all that, aren't you?
We are. And Michael, the skills required, honestly, are difficult to find in a single individual. And so for that reason, what we've really been seeing become common is that the skill sets for evaluating against the AIMS, the 42001 AIMS, really requires a team. AI literacy becomes the foundation. Auditing skills are a foundation. Beyond that, we really have to consider the context of the AI management system that we're evaluating to understand what specific skills would be needed. That is, a fraud detection system is going to have fundamentally different requirements for operation than a radiological review system, a computer vision system. And so really understanding what that is based on the scoping and context that's set forth in the scoping statement tells us how to think about building the team that can be successful performing that audit.
And when we're looking at standards, community enforced standards markets like ISO, et cetera, one of the great things we trumpet is that it's industry led, that industry is informed. Of course, when you're talking to industry, they often feel that they were moderately well involved, although buried under auditing jargon at the beginning. And then once the thing gets a life, it kind of goes off on its own and never comes back to them. Now, this standard's only 2.5 years old, so it's a very early days here. But in your work out in the field, has your experience working in industry informed your perspective on how this guidance ought to be evolving and moving?
Without question, Michael, to your point that, 42001 in any consensus-based standard necessarily will be inclusive. And so we have what by and large becomes, generic is not the right word, but I'll use it here, a generic set of goals and requirements that, again, through clause 4, have to be custom tailored to the specific context of the organization. And I think that can be lost in the process. What we do see is that there is lots of industry representation in the standards creation process. What I would say is that just because there's lots of varied industry representation doesn't mean that we necessarily have representation from organizations of varying sizes. We might have a lot of enterprise input. We might have a lot of small and medium enterprise input. But as we think about the mom and pop businesses that are still bound to the requirements of regulation in some cases, at the very least, the requirements of market pressure, I don't know that we necessarily have the necessary input from those groups. A big example here, we released 42001 again in December of 2023 with the expectation that really understanding the standard and creating implementation mechanisms and implementation guides could be left to the third-party market. The reality is most organizations don't have additional funds to hire advisors and readiness firms. in that market to help themselves build the tools that they need. And so a simple solution is let's create an implementation guide. We know what the standard is. We know what the thought behind the original intent was. Let's create an implementation guide that organizations of all sizes can use to at least put themselves on the road to successfully building and implementing an AI management system. And though we're in the process of doing that now, still we're almost 3 years out of the standard going final in the market. So 3 years of organizations left wondering, what do I even do with this? Which I think is really at the heart of why we do see so much confusion around the utility of the standard today.
And we were there before. ISO 9000, everybody talked about implementation guidelines, standards, templates, and they never arrived.
Right.
With 14,000, they sort of arrived. I was involved in Acorn, which is a standard for SMEs and things of that ilk. Yeah, it's a shame we're not quicker. I've often said what I'd love to see is an award ceremony, for the best management systems, whether it's 42,000 or 40 every year, but under the requirement that you then publish it so that people can actually see what a real working system is like and kind of break it open. But that's a thought. Just a couple of quick staccato questions, very quickly. Are there any sectors where you do see AI standards harmonizing internationally at speed?
Michael, I'll have to say no, but it's not a hard no. What I do see is we are seeing sectors like financial services, healthcare, regardless of geography. We're seeing those sectors tend to align on best practice and guidance. But as far as a de facto standard for that particular vertical, I haven't yet experienced that.
Well, 42,001 is a product, right? So the products, as we said, is just out the gates.
Right.
Where's it weak? Where's it not doing the job it should do? And you can tell my next question is going to be what might be an extension of it that it ought to go to. But start with, where's it weak? Where's it cracking? And it just isn't functioning.
Yeah, and the weaknesses and the cracks in the system as it's deployed to the market today, I don't know is in the framework as much as it is in the education of those that are implementing it. What I do see is that we, in many ways, have a hammer, and we have not yet taught people how to wield that hammer. I think that really is the next level of maturity for 42001 as an international standard is real market education. Informed consumers, informed buyers that understand not just the framework. The framework's easy to read. I think the standard itself is 45 or 50 pages long, so it's not that burdensome and overwhelming. What is unknown, however, is the intent in many ways. And so what we have is lots of different buyers, lots of different organizations bringing their own perspective to the standard. And in many cases, those perspectives completely miss the point.
And are your clients, what do they compare 42,001 with? Do they go straight and say, this is kind of like a 9,000 implementation we did, or do they compare it with something else, or do they find it sui generis?
So I think the most apt comparison for most of our customers is 27001. Primarily because of that high level structure. Again, we do see such commonalities there that it can be easy to educate that through one lens, we're looking at information security, through another, we're looking at our AI lifecycle.
Very good, very good. And extensions. I mean, you spent quite a bit of very useful time explaining, how this fits in with the 18286 and the bits, and they got NIST standards and all that. But what would the next phase be, in your opinion? Where could we do more good?
And this is more an acute need now, but we have to do better at formalizing expectations around agentic AI governance. And Adam, again, thank you for the paper you and your team released earlier this week. I think that really becomes a piece of leverage that everyone can use to think more cleanly. But that absolutely is the next immediate need for all communities working with AI.
From a standardization perspective, I think interoperability will be a future topic for agentic. I think looking at how agents interact with each other.
Yes.
The paper that Patrick kindly mentioned was very much about regulatory perspective, and we analysed 8 different EU regulatory acts, and particularly with regard to the AI Act. The way people are trying to use AI agents is fundamentally incompatible with the product safety regime that we were talking about before. And unless people are willing to bound them and ensure that there isn't behavioral drift, they're going to struggle to ever get in compliance with the current regulatory frame.
And people can find that paper on the aiqi.org website, I assume. Good. Just putting the plugs in.
Yes, where they belong, where they belong.
That's good. Well, look, it's been a wonderful chat, but I just wanted to conclude on one question, if you wouldn't mind. Um, and it is a global question. If you could change one thing about how AI is currently governed globally, what might it be?
Honestly, and this might sound counterproductive because we know consensus-based systems take time. But I do think we need more perspectives at the table, quite frankly. I see this imbalance between the global north and global south today, wherein there is a lot of incredible development around regulation and standardization, but most of it's coming from the global north with the expectation that the global south will simply adopt. So I think there have to be more voices, more representation with global perspective.
Hmm.
Short of that, I think largely we're on the right path. We just need to move more quickly, which I know is not how the process works, but everything in me wants us to close these loops as quickly as we possibly can.
Oh, well, standards, as you say, consensus-based standards take a while. I personally am a little dismayed at my phrase is not doing their homework. I was at an event just a couple of weeks ago, and I had to endure about 8 hours of people up on stage talking about AI regulation from many nations and very senior individuals. And not one of them had heard of 42,001. It was depressing. I finally got up in the audience and gave a 5-minute diatribe, and they all came up to me and went, "Oh, we didn't even know it existed," but they were happy to be racing out there as AI experts, and they took their places on the panel, all about standards and regulations. It wasn't as if I was asking some kind of researcher on transformer theory to talk about legal laws, and they were all very, very senior. So I think we've got a lot to do to get the message out, and with advocates like you and supporters like Adam, I'm glad to see it. So thank you very much. Well, thank you, Patrick, for sharing your thoughts with us today. I'd also like to always thank my co-host, Adam Leon Smith, for his inputs and thoughts as well, and all of you for listening to the show. And please join us next time for more on standards, ethics, and regulation of AI here on our AI Standards Stack podcast.
Thank you all.